Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 131, Richard III, and Thus I Clothe My Naked Villainy. Last time, I took you through the third part of Shakespeare's Henry VI plays, but of course that was not the end of this part of England's story. That was clearly a fascination for Shakespeare. As the actors left the stage following the end of the play, with the lords paying homage to King Edward's young son and the start of his dynasty, it is Richard's last aside that lingers. To say the truth, so Judas kissed his master and cried all hail, when as he meant all harm. This unveiled threat completely undercuts the very last lines of the play that express Edward's hope for the future. Surely, audiences left knowing that the story of King Richard III would be coming soon to a playhouse near them, and Shakespeare did not disappoint. Although there is no accurate dating for Richard III, it's thought to have been written sometime between 1592 and 1594. This is given that it clearly is a direct continuation of the two later Henry VI plays, and that Marlowe's play Edward II is thought to have been heavily influenced by it. As Marlowe died at the end of May 1593, and his play appeared in print soon after his death, he must have had sight of Richard III in 1592. It first appeared in print in a quarto edition in late 1597. The popularity of the play meant that there was a second quarto edition published the following year, and it is this edition which attributed authorship to Shakespeare. Before the first folio in 1623, there were 4 more quarto editions produced, which are testament to the continuing popularity of the play. Each of those quarto editions included changes, printing errors and printing corrections relative to those that had gone before, and the first folio version includes about 200 lines that do not appear in any of the quarto editions, but omits nearly 40 lines that do appear in one or more of the earlier quartos. Because of that frequent reprinting, this play is a particularly good example of how the plays have to be reconstructed by an editor from multiple sources, and how they have to make judgments about what they consider to be the best version of the text. In this case, it's possible to see that the first folio version was mostly copied from the third quarto, an edition that was published in 1602. The assumption is that Hemmings and Condell, who must have known the play well, considered this the best version and then made their own amendments and corrections as they prepared the text for printing. Therefore, the first folio is generally considered to be the most authoritative version, once several obvious printing errors of the first folio are amended. The quarto editions call the play The Tragedy of King Richard III, containing his treacherous plots against his brother Clarence, the pitiful murder of his innocent nephews, his tyrannical usurpation, with the whole course of his detested life and most deserved death. Which leaves us in little doubt as to the context of the play. But the first folio titles it as a history play and gives nothing else away. The play clearly fits the mould of a history play rather than a tragedy. After all, Richard does not start from a high point and fall, and does not show one particular bad trait that causes his fall and death. He is rotten from the start, and with no redeeming features in the traditional sense. It is generally thought that the title of the play as a tragedy in those quarto editions was not Shakespeare's doing, but the work of a printer who wanted to make it very clear that this play was not a celebration of Richard's time on the throne, something that probably would not have got past the censor in the stationer's office, let alone across the Privy Council table, without some stern action. Once again, it is Holinshed's Chronicles and Edward Hall's union of the two illustrious families of Lancaster and York that provide the source material for Richard III, as they did for the Henry VI plays. However, when we look at the general tone of the play and Shakespeare's characterisation of Richard, it's almost certain that Shakespeare was taking his lead from Sir Thomas More's unfinished History of King Richard III, which he wrote in about 1513. That is particularly interesting because More had a personal connection with those around Richard at the time of the events depicted in the play. As a young man, More had spent time working in the household of Cardinal Morton, who was Lord Chancellor to Henry VII. Prior to this, Morton, as he rose up the administrative ranks at court, was one of the lawyers in 1459 who drew up the Act of Attainder against Yorkist lords that allowed Parliament to seize their lands, following the first unsuccessful Yorkist uprising. When York's forces gained the upper hand, Morton narrowly avoided decapitation and was imprisoned in the Tower of London. He escaped to France and joined with Margaret, returning to England with her forces and then back to France when she was defeated. He was eventually rehabilitated by Edward VI, but was then accused of treason by Richard while preparing for Prince Edward's coronation. This is shown in Act 3, Scene 4 of the play, and Morton features as the Bishop of Ely, one of the several religious positions that he held. Once again, he managed to avoid death, but was held under house arrest until he escaped to France, only to be recalled to England by Henry Tudor after Richard's death. Now, he clearly had no love for Richard, and no doubt fed the young Thomas More with a very biased view of the late king. It is More who turned Richard III into the deformed arch-villain that the Tudors loved to hate, and presented Shakespeare with a character that he could run with. As a more general influence on the play, it's suggested that we see Seneca in the chorus-like group of bitter and sorrowful women in the play, and in some of the elaborate rhetoric. Seneca's influence appears in other Shakespeare plays and in those by other playwrights of the period. His work was certainly studied by the university-educated playwrights and, it seems, by Shakespeare too. And Shakespeare was not alone in tackling Richard's story. There was a published verse retelling of the lives of significant players in the story, Richard, Hastings, Edward VI, Buckingham and others, called A Mirror for Magistrates, and a late 1570s play in Latin by Thomas Legge, a master at Cambridge. This only existed in manuscript form, and although copied many times and a well-regarded piece at the time, as far as we know, it was never printed, so it's perhaps unlikely that Shakespeare knew of its existence. There was also a play called The True Tragedy of Richard III by an anonymous author that was published in 1594, so had probably been performed in the years immediately preceding that date. For anyone who saw the Henry VI plays, the reintroduction of the character of Richard holds no surprises. From the off, Shakespeare made it clear that Richard's villainy knew no bounds, and that he would not be deeply analysing his behaviour or trying to present some psychological truth about it. As an audience, we are asked to become Richard's co-conspirators. He draws us in with his knowing asides and seemingly reckless planning that somehow always comes off. For a character who should be repulsive, we find, instead of revulsion, a kind of unwilling admiration. Whereas in the Henry VI plays, I could discuss how the plays lacked a central character, with Richard, we are in no doubt that he is the central point of this play, and we see the world of the Yorkist kings from his perspective. So here is the very briefest of plot summaries. As the play opens, Richard tells us how, in an effort to gain the crown, he has manipulated the king, his brother Edward, to mistrust Clarence, his brother, who is sent to the Tower of London. Richard has Clarence killed and marries the Lady Anne, even though he was party to the deaths of her father-in-law, Henry VI, and her husband, Henry's son, Prince Edward. When King Edward succumbs to illness, his young son, another Edward, comes under Richard's care as regent. Richard places Edward and his younger brother in the Tower and seizes the crown. After his coronation, he has the princes killed and then arranges for the poisoning of Lady Anne, freeing him to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, to shore up his legitimacy. Richard shows himself to be completely ruthless in his ambition, killing off anybody who he suspects is not being completely loyal to him. The nobles begin to turn against Richard and side with Henry Tudor, the Earl of Richmond. Their armies meet. Richard is unseated from his horse and killed on the battlefield. Richmond becomes Henry VII and vows to marry Elizabeth of York, thereby uniting the houses of York and Lancaster and starting the Tudor dynasty. So even in that bare-bones plot summary, you can see how the play is centred on Richard, and he is given no redeeming features or actions regardless of the historical facts. Although, to be fair, some of those are still shrouded in mystery, and it's just possible that Richard was responsible for some, maybe all, of the actions that Shakespeare puts into his hands. Richard opens the play with a 40-line soliloquy, starting with the famous lines about his brother, the king. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. But he quickly makes it clear that he doesn't fit into this world of courtly life, a world of inaction and soft furnishings. And as he did in Henry VI Part 3, he blames his ill-formed body for his nature. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking-glass, I, that am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph, I, that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. This justification is elaborate, but execution of his plans is ruthless. Not that he needed it, but his success in getting Clarence arrested emboldens Richard, especially when Clarence remains convinced of Richard's loyalty to him until his final moments. Once Richard has resolved that Clarence will not live another day, he immediately moves on to a resolution to marry Lady Anne, a woman who has every reason to hate him, and all this just in his second soliloquy of the play. This opening is a brave move by Shakespeare. There is no need for a prologue here, standing somewhat outside of the action and looking in. That detachment from the central character is the last thing that Shakespeare wants. From the start, he embeds the audience into the action through the centrality of Richard, as he acts as prologue and then as our guide through the action. The Henry VI plays had moments of theatricality, encompassed in characters like Talbot, Queen Margaret and Jack Cade, and scenes of brilliant theatricality, like the plucking of the red and the white roses and the tormenting of York with the paper crown. But nothing draws us into the action like the scheming of Richard does. In many productions of Richard III, the last soliloquy from Henry VI Part 3, where Richard describes his physical form, is included in the opening scenes of the play. In that, he says he will play the orator and add colours to the chameleon, making him sound very much like a theatrical player in all but name. In the next scene, Lady Anne enters with the body of Henry VI, which is being taken for burial with honours. Richard halts and ultimately diverts the cortege to a meaner burial. But the meat of the scene concerns the wordplay between Richard and Anne, and her horror as she realises that he is proposing marriage. She succumbs to his wishes and takes his ring, a turnaround that has worried many critics. Are we really to believe that she does not see through Richard's attempt at smooth words? It is quite a turnaround, and I think the only justification would be that Anne realises that she has no agency in this choice, however unpalatable it might be for her, and that to acquiesce to Richard's demands is her only option. That could be a historically correct position. In the play, she ends up dead, poisoned at Richard's hand, which is one of the points where Shakespeare departs from history. Anne almost certainly died from tuberculosis, and Richard was almost certainly grief-stricken at her death. But there were rumours at the time that her death was rather convenient for the king, and from a dramatic point of view, taking the worst view of potential scenarios plays right into Shakespeare's hands. For many, this is the strongest scene in the play, where we can see how Richard not only understands the power that he has, but that he can use it, mixed with twisted reasoning and cajoling, so that it has the desired effect. He mixes reason with threat in a cocktail that Anne cannot resist, even though she realises that it will lead to her death. Perhaps in this darker side of the portrayal of Richard, we can see something of the influence of Marlowe on Shakespeare. He is so brazen, such a Machiavellian scoundrel, and so effectively described by the other characters, for example, as a toad, by Queen Margaret, or a bottled spider, that line that inspired Anthony Scher's famous interpretation for the RSC production in 1984. The scheming Richard is as wicked, nimble of mind, and as resourceful as Marlowe's Barabbas, the Jew of Malta. He's as reckless in his determination as Dr. Faustus, and as ambitious in his own way as Tamburlaine. But where Marlowe could be criticised for his difficulty in handling verse consistently throughout his plays, the young Shakespeare already seems to have found his stride. And in the plotting, Shakespeare has found a drive and a clear-cut purpose that Marlowe never quite achieved. Having said that, where the play suffers is in the characterisation of the minor characters, who are given little time for development, as the play focuses relentlessly on Richard, and that clear-cut drive means that the play has less scope than the two later Henry VI plays to explore motivations and the subtleties of character. The lesser figures tend to explain themselves in words rather than by deed, and their motivations are not always explicit. Even when Richard's plans don't initially work out, he's still able to turn things around to his advantage. After he has dispatched Buckingham to orchestrate an adoring crowd to elevate him to the throne, like some populist Roman emperor, he is on a high with anticipation, but Buckingham returns with unfulfilled purpose. Despite seeding the crowd with his own retainers, the people did not take up the acclamation of Richard, apparently seeing through his unsavoury methods. It is a scene that is very reminiscent of Antony's attempt to crown Caesar in Julius Caesar, where Antony has to offer Caesar the laurel several times before he will accept the elevation. Richard is less politically astute than Caesar, and perhaps more willing to do whatever it takes, and only finally gets the crown once he has feigned piety and, like Caesar, a reluctance to accept the elevation. Richard, revealed as being deep in prayer, is perhaps one of the most amusing scenes in the whole play, where his sheer effrontery is laid bare, this time in the face of God. Whether men around Richard are either enamoured by him, fearful of him, or simply ineffectual in the face of his determination, it falls to the women to see through him. Anne sees him for what he is, but is powerless to resist. But together with Elizabeth, Edward's wife, and the Duchess of York, Richard's mother, she makes up a chorus of women who try to stand in his way and form an emotional core to the play. Where the men speak of Richard and his ambitions in political terms, the women bring it to a familial level. As the ageing Margaret, widow of Henry VI, says to Elizabeth, "I had an Edward till a Richard killed him. I had a Henry till a Richard killed him. Thou hadst an Edward till a Richard killed him. Thou hast a Richard till a Richard killed him." The repetition there serves to express the intensity of the pain and the grief that these women feel. However much Richard tries to ignore them and belittle their feelings, their voices, their laments are heard. And what should we make of the presence of Queen Margaret in this play? It is, I think, one of the most striking elements in it. As I recently rewatched the play in two separate productions, I was struck by how her presence twists this history play into something that is much more menacing and rooted in the supernatural than we might expect. Her insights and curses, spoken directly to those who have harmed her, are some of Shakespeare's best, and he was a playwright who was good with a curse. After holding Elizabeth and others implicated in her son's death to account, Margaret says of and to Richard, "And leave thee out? Stay, dog, for thou shalt hear if heaven has any grievous plague in store exceeding those that I can wish upon thee. Oh, let them keep it till thy sins be ripe, and then hurl down their indignation on thee, the troubler of the poor world's peace. The worm of conscience still begnaw thy soul. Thy friends suspect for traitors whilst thou livest, and take deep traitors for thy dearest friends. No sleep close up that deadly eye of thine, unless it be while some tormenting dream afflicts thee with a hell of ugly devils. Thou elvish-marked, abortive, rooting hog! Thou that wast sealed in thy nativity, the slave of nature and the son of hell, thou slander of thy heavy mother's womb, thou loathed issue of thy father's loins, thou rag of honour, thou detested. At which point Richard tries to insert her name, and she cries out his. And her predictions of the deaths of various protagonists, including Richard, relentlessly come true. As these predictions are remembered throughout the play by various characters, they show a structure where we might see that Richard is not at all in control as he thinks he is. Rather, he is being driven by some greater power into a narrower and narrower corridor of opportunity, and his end is inevitable. In Shakespeare's version of history, Margaret, although banished, has remained in the country, somehow managing to live in the castle where her son was murdered, retaining her grief and bitterness so that she can feed off it and, as she hopes, spread her agonies to the Yorkist factions. As I mentioned before, historically Margaret returned to France sometime after the death of Henry VI and her son, and played no further part in English politics. In fact, she was dead by the time of the events at the end of the play. But Shakespeare keeps her on as a character, who appears mysteriously wandering in the court, where those she insults and threatens with her predictions are incapable of evicting her. There seems to be an expectation here of the suspension of disbelief by the audience, but the introduction of the ideas of witchcraft and superstition, and the potential for prophecy, gives her a mystical air, which all the other characters, for all the power that they have, seem to fear. And there is yet a little more to her role in the play. Margaret's is the only voice besides Richard's that tries to guide our viewpoint of the play. She, like him, takes on a chorus-type role, pleading the case for a point of view in a way that is sometimes detached from the action. Richard, in his deformity, and Margaret, in her old age, are both different sides of the same grotesque, at least as the Elizabethan eyes would have seen it. They may be diametrically opposed in their views and solutions, but are joined by the abnormality of their bodies. This reading would depend on how far Richard's physical deformity is played on in production. He clearly sees it as the cause of his villainy, whereas Margaret sees it as a sign of his black heart. However, by making Richard, a well-established liar and immoral schemer, the critic of his own form, Shakespeare puts doubt on his explanations, and Margaret doesn't get a free pass either. Richard's explanation of his deformity being an expression of his wickedness is, to the Tudor mind, put into doubt because it is expressed by an old and ugly woman, who is borderline witch, and therefore also an unreliable source. The misogyny, not to mention the ageism, is evident, and plays into the stereotype and stigmas maintained in the period, without our modern sensibilities. It seems not unreasonable to think that at the time the physical differences of both Richard and Margaret were viewed with a similar degree of aversion, if not revulsion. Significantly, Richard never shows any remorse for his actions, but he doesn't escape the terrors of guilt manifested upon him in the shape of apparitions of his murdered victims. Again, as in the presence of Queen Margaret, we have the influence of the supernatural looming large in this play. So often in this play, Shakespeare's innate sense of theatrical entertainment is clear, both in the actions on stage and in the lines that his characters speak. The image of the limping Richard crying, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," right at the end of the play remains one of Shakespeare's best-known images and lines. And he was wise to ensure that we see Richard's final demise as, lacking the horse that he couldn't find, he is surrounded and then killed on the battlefield. We see every moment of his death. Justice is served. This is perhaps what we remember most from the end of the play, but for the original audience, perhaps the most significant part was the triumph of Henry Tudor. He embodies hope, as do the final lines of the play. "Oh, now let Richmond and Elizabeth, the true succeeders of each royal house, by God's fair ordinance conjoin together, and let their heirs, God, if thy will be so, enrich the time to come with smooth-faced peace, with smiling plenty and fair prosperous days. Abate the edge of traitors, gracious Lord, that would reduce these bloody days again and make poor England weep in streams of blood. Let them not live to taste the land's increase, that would with treason wound this fair land's peace. Now civil wounds are stopped, peace lives again, that she may long live here, God, say Amen. As Stanley Wells observed, the play also gives us some insight into the acting styles of the time. In Act 3, Richard addresses his partner in crime, the Duke of Buckingham, saying, "Come, cousin, canst thou quake and change thy colour? Murder thy breath in middle of a word, and then begin again and stop again, as if thou wert distraught and mad with terror?" To which Buckingham replies, "Tut, I can counterfeit the deep tragedian. Tremble and start at wagging of a straw, speak and look back, and pry to each side, intending deep suspicion. Ghastly looks are at my service, like enforced smiles, and both are ready for their offices at any time to grace my stratagems." When John Webster described his ideal of the excellent actor in 1615, he could have been describing the effect of Richard III on stage. He said, "By a full and significant action of body he charms our attention. Sit in a full theatre, and you will think so many lines drawn from the circumference of so many ears, whilst the actor is in the centre." Assuming that the original audience for Richard III was aware of his role in history and how his demise led to the founding of the current regime, we have to wonder if the effect of being drawn in by Richard's evil nature left those watching his initial successes and listening to his twisted logic finding themselves subverted by him. The overt moral of the play is one of providential morality. Good in the form of Henry Tudor wins out. But if we come to like Richard, however perverse that might be, does that subvert the morality of the play? The question also touches on the nature of theatre at the time and how it was perceived by the authorities, those who liked play-going, and those who saw it as a threat. The study of history was considered a valuable occupation by the Tudors, and one that had, generally speaking, been confined to the upper classes who could read Latin and French and had access to books. History was something that could be learnt from and was one of the major parts of the education syllabus at the time. However, what it taught was the importance of hereditary rights and how a person's place in society was more or less immobile and dependent on birth. These ideas and traditional views were becoming strained as Tudor society became more mercantile, was influenced by immigration, and began to look outward to an empire full of opportunity for the individual. Players and the playhouses were seen by many to be the heart of this disruption. They were places where men and women could mix more freely than elsewhere in society, places where anybody could stand or sit next to anybody else if they could afford to pay the entrance fee, and not based on their place in society. Many could afford the penny to stand in the yard, and perhaps some who could afford more chose to stand there. There were, after all sorts of additional distractions concerning food, drink, all sorts of other purchases, and opportunities concerning the opposite sex on offer in the playhouse. In the more expensive sections it seems doubtful that the poorest groundlings made it there to sit next to a gent. But that gent might find himself next to an alderman or even a lord. Then on stage, boys were dressed as women and players dressed as kings and lords. The sumptuary laws that dictated who could wear what based on their trade and their place in society gave special exemption to players in performance. We know from wills of the time that aristocrats left their clothes to their servants when they died. As servants couldn't wear these clothes, in public at least, one option, if they couldn't be adapted for daily use, was to sell them to the players. We also know from Henslow's diary that he paid large sums for costumes on several occasions, and he ran a system of fines for any actor who removed a costume from the playhouse, so valuable were they. So, these lowly players, who were often thought of as chameleons, just like Richard said himself, were performing in genuinely aristocratic clothes, and lines in society that had been very firm were becoming blurred. Not everybody thought that that was such a good idea. By equating himself closely to the acting profession, the disruption that Richard causes can be projected into the new Tudor society, and may have given the contemporary audience much to think on. For those who had studied history and revered its influence and teaching, seeing a history play like Richard III in the raucous atmosphere of the playhouse might well have made them wonder long and hard about the direction in which society was turning. The modern view of Shakespeare's Richard III is that the historical character is much maligned by the playwright. It is a charge not unique to this history play. In fact, all 10 include some degree of manipulation of historical fact. But this is down to the fact, at least in part, that Shakespeare's sources were often very biased, and he was creating a play for the entertainment of people in his audience, not a work seeking a factual truth. But that's not to say that he was not seeking truths about human nature and societal issues of the time. I think we have to admit that his approach worked. As we heard last time, interest in Richard III is largely still present because of Shakespeare's play, however inaccurate the portrayal of the late king might be. Perhaps we sense Shakespeare's enormous liking for his character because he too is essentially an actor, like several of Shakespeare's greatest creations. Richard II, Hamlet, and Iago, for example. All in their different ways are very much more subtle than Richard, but they are acting a part, taking on the mantle of another soul, just like their creator did in his own small way. Next time, there will be a little more on Richard, as I'm going to discuss some of the issues raised by a recent production of the play in London, which illustrates very well how this play can still, 400 years on, raise some very heated debates. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find a podcast on Instagram or X just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can find details of ways to support the podcast at the New Look website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp.